And now we have one session on the humanities. And we planned this session basically to, understand the word, this very concept of sustainable development and, put some more critical focus on this. To moderate this session, Professor Vijay Gudavardi has kindly agreed. So I just want to introduce Professor Gudavardi to people who are not really from the development studies or who really not have done, any course on economics. Otherwise, Professor Gudavardi is a very, acclaimed scholar in this field. So just to, without a very brief sort of bio note, it's an academic profile basically. Dr. Vijay Gudavardi is currently is an associate professor at the School of Economics, University of Hyderabad. So he worked also as the faculty at the National Academy of Legal Studies and Research and Institute of Public Enterprise as well. And then also he got his PhD in the development studies from the Institute of Social Studies in The Hague. He also had Netherlands fellowships programs, and he's also the recipient of the Sanjay Thakur Young Labor Economist Award. It's a very prestigious one from the ISLE during 2008. He was also nominated by the ILO as a subject expert for meeting of Wage Board Government of Telangana during 2024 and 5. His publications basically include so many important, articles and chapters. For example, one is Development through Informalization and Circulation of Labor, the Emerging Anatomy of Uncivil Society. It's a chapter in the book edited by Akash Singh Rathore, and it came out, I think, from so another article he has published on Ambedkar on the quest for justice, and that came out also as in Legal and Economic Justice, Oxford University Press, New Delhi. And he co-authored papers with another very important political scientist of our time, Ajay Gudavardi, and the paper was in 2020, it came out, and it's on social policy and political mobilizations in India. And it was published in the journal, a very reputed journal, Development and Change. So with that very brief, academic introduction, now I request Professor Vijay Gudavardi to take over from here. Thank you so much for agreeing to, moderate and to participate in this I expect that's a very, interesting and important session. So over to you, Professor Gudavardi.
Yeah, so let me first begin by thanking Dhritiman for asking me to anchor this very important panel discussion. A warm welcome to all the participants and especially to the speakers in the panel. So the title of the panel discussion, or the theme rather, is Disaster and the Politics of Sustainable Development. So I'll just briefly begin by way of maybe expressing the ignorance of the economists, because I teach environmental economics, and I know the limits of my own discipline, and that's the reason why I accepted this, because it's always an opportunity to learn. And here, we have, for instance, we begin by discussing the concept of disaster itself. Going back into the classical economics, we have always treated natural resources as free access resources. So we treat them as if they don't have any value, and disaster as usually an external shock, something which is very natural and so on. Now, of course, over a period of time, we do realize that there is an anthropogenic kind of reasoning, and what we call as development often, is responsible for several disasters. And to that extent, therefore, when developmental choices are being done, far from it really benefiting the entire society, there are always conflicting choices, and that's where I think the politics of sustainability comes in, because what is it that is being sustained? We usually say, for instance, in the mainstream economics, look at it as sustaining growth and consumption, whereas sustainability could have several other meanings: sustaining survival opportunities, livelihoods, or sustaining what is referred to as carrying capacity in the nature, which affects biodiversity and life itself. So given these kinds of highly conflicting choices, and given the idea that we are passing through what is called as post-normal science kind of an era, where the social and the so-called objective universal generalizations are intertwined, and no scientific knowledge in that sense is independent of social prejudices, ethics, social choices. So therefore, we have come onto a point of democratic deliberation of sorts, away from markets, away from cooperation, away from a variety of other institutional mechanisms of dealing with these conflicting choices. And I think it is in that context this panel makes immense sense and relevance. So we have three very very knowledgeable scholars, Miss Kiki Doma Bhutia, Dr. Deepti Tamang, and Dr. Anubha Anushri. Right. So we have three speakers. I will be introducing the titles as we proceed. Each one of you would get about 20 minutes each to speak, and then that would be followed by maybe a set of questions and some discussions, before which I would perhaps do some overall summation of the kind of contributions that each one of you would have made. So now I request Ms. Kiki Doma Bhutia. The title of her presentation is Proverbs, Disaster and Cultural Sustainability in Post-GLOF Sikkim. Right, so that's the updated title, I suppose. So please go ahead and present. You get 20 minutes. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vijay, for introducing. I don't know whether my screen is...
Yeah. Your detailed kind of bios have been circulated to all the viewers, so they're all aware of your contributions. Yeah, so please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I wanted to also start by thanking Debarati and, of course, my dear friend Prajanya for putting Debarati and me together and for inviting me for this really topical and timely conference and conversations that we are having. I was in another panel on environmental crisis in geography discipline, and it was also very interesting for me to attend that. Upon saying that, when I told my mother this morning that I have a conference presentation and I barely had 2 days to prepare, Debarati was telling me it's like 30 minutes or 40 minutes. And I was like completely panicking within past 2 days. And when I told my mom, she responded by saying that, and I will say this in Bhutia, Michiklot chochik migalot chogya, which means to one person, one aspect of knowledge is enough. But for 100, even if you tell 1 or 100 knowledge, it might not be enough. So thus, with my mother's proverbial blessings, my talk today, as Professor Vijay has mentioned, will severely draw from the aspect of proverb in the current Sikkim's environmental crisis, that is glacial lake outburst flood that recently happened in 2023. And that correlates to the theme of conference soliciting disaster and its afterlife, and this panel particularly looking at sustainability of culture, of vernacular knowledge, or of wisdom traditions in Sikkim. Before I delve inside, why can't I change my presentation? There's something wrong with my... Wait. Oh my God. Okay. I'm not able to move my screen.
We could see your PPT, but now it's not. Yeah, it has visible.
And it's happening. Maybe like.
Yeah, it's visible now. So yeah.
Can you see?
Yeah, you can just operate with it. Maybe it just needs to be converted to a full screen. That's all.
Okay. Can you see now?
Yeah, we can see your PPT. Yes. That's perfect. Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. So proverb is generally short, known sentences of the folk, which contains wisdom, truth, moral, and traditional views in a metaphorical, fixed, and memorizable form. And it has been studied for such a long period of time. I will look particularly from Wolfgang Meter, who is known as also father of proverb. And later on, it has been carried on, his idea has been carried on further, as proverbs are familiar, fixed, and sensual expressions that express well-known truth, social norms, or moral concerns. As we trace the changes, what has been studied in the field of proverb, we can also see that proverb, also the meaning and definition of proverb has also transformed. For example, we also have newer versions of proverb in 2000 that talks about, by Fernando, who talks about most proverbs can be manipulated or transformed in various ways according to the communicative needs of the language user. So when we look at different aspects of proverb, and when we look at proverb in context of folklore, we look at three main aspects. For example, proverb variation occurs mainly in syntactic, morphological, lexical level. In that case, if we give an example, the most popular proverb I used here is an example of a stitch in time saves 9. When we use it in lexical term, it can be a stitch in time saves money. Or in syntactic way, if you make a stitch in time, you will save 9 later. Or in morphological way, stitch in timely fashion, 9 are saved. So these different proverbs that we are interchangeable syntactically, it focuses on patterns or metaphors or oppositions. For example, some proverbs also show binary oppositions, focusing on fortune and misfortune or wisdom and foolishness. Second aspect of proverb, like we have seen that happened during COVID-19 very popularly, was how there was a creative use of proverb in social media. One of the most interesting example was a mask today keeps the virus away, or show you care with what you wear. There are also different aspects of proverb like anti-proverb, pseudo-proverb, reflecting on conventionality or innovation. Anti-proverb, like we popularly use curiosity kills the cat, but there are also anti-proverb that focus on how curiosity killed the cat, but satisfaction brought it back, right? Or the early bad bird catches the worm, but the second mouse gets the cheese. So there are these anti-proverb. And the third part focuses on base meaning, where we look at proverb as a performance. For example, we look at speakers' evaluation and what are their intent when they are talking about some proverb that are evoked ironically, like honesty is the best policy, can be used to advise somebody, to use as a cautionary narrative, but also sometimes sarcastically if someone has done something dishonest. And the newest example includes Meader himself, who has published a book in 2021 about proverbs are the best policy. And he shows how users adapt fixed saying for content-specific communication. And in some cases, even the sayings itself are not fixed. My interest for me in proverb are in two phases. First phases are mostly when I came fresh out of master's. Then I came back to Sikkim. I was jobless and I was looking for opportunities, either applying for PhDs in, I don't know, Jadavpur University, Delhi University, everywhere. I sent my application and failing miserably because I didn't have JRF, and or finding government job in Sikkim. And I was lucky enough to land a job in Namgyal Institute of Tibetology for 2 years in 2014 to 2016. And first project that I worked there landed in my lab that's called Proverb and Saying. This project included documentation and interpretation of proverbs that was collected from now late Lachen Rinpoche and Agepema, who was very ardent about collecting proverbs. And we looked at how these proverbs, collected proverbs, were originated, what are the stories, what are the oral histories of these proverbs, how we use it, what are the meanings, how it is interpreted. And this was provided by, as you can see, Aju again in the picture, but he's no more. And he used to be a language teacher. So we spent at least 40 hours having interviewed with him, discussing these proverbs. And the first phase of the proverb that we collected based on the Namgyal Institute project included, we categorize it in three different variety or category. First is khatam, that is an oral tradition that has been passed down from generation to advise as you like a cautionary narrative. And in that aspect, number one is Nyempe patam machungpa jompi chagi denchipya, means instead of selling the conceited words of a fool, imitate the action of a smart person. Second is petam, where we talk about me kawa chinglo labjudi, shing shaga chilo jegjudi, means an open-minded person is easy to talk to, like climbing a tree full of branches. And dentam, which are narration of an experience based on true event, like tikpasana gyamtsokho, which means every drop of water fills the ocean. These proverbs were very traditional proverbs, and they mostly looked at cautionary narrative or religious themes, or very Buddhistic themes about being a good person, being open person, being kind person. And the result of this proverb project included, we made a video recording of almost 50 different proverbs, and where we feature different acting performances by teachers, Bhutia language teacher, monk, different elders of the community. And then these were shared in Facebook or YouTube. And if you would like, you can check. I have one of the example. I will not play it fully because we won't understand it. This is just to give an example. Second experience of proverb, like the first Tibetology experience was almost like 10 years ago in 2014. I did this project and then I completely forgot about it. And in I started my PhD in University of in the University of Tartu in Estonia, and I focused on completely different topic. And after my PhD recently in 2023, when I gave birth to my baby, and she was born on 30th of September, and I came home from hospital on 3rd of October, and then I lost touch with my family. And when I tried to speak with my family, I was informed of the glacial lake flood outburst that happened on 4th October, because of which for 2 weeks I was not in touch with my family. And it was not like only event that happened in Sikkim, because over the past decade there has been multiple environmental crises like landslides, a lot of cars been in accident, a lot of water rising. This has been happening, and there has been multiple scientific studies also that indicated that there is a rise in the number and size of glacial lakes in Sikkim. Also, when I was in this another panel on environmental crisis, there was a scholar, Manasi, I forgot her last name. She was also talking about how Sikkim is one of the most, along the Himalayan belt, one of the most sensitive area with very unpredictable environmental situation at the moment. And there are five main reasons why this glacial lake outburst happened, the particular glacial lake outburst, and many other minor things that are happening. Minor in a sense that it doesn't have maybe victims, but it's still very intense. So first, we can say it's climate change in the Himalayas. The environmental are becoming fragile. This is the only natural reason. Apart from that, it's all man-made reason. And number one is the hydropower project dams in Sikkim, which has been intensively, 21 of the entire dam in the Himalayan belt could be seen today. And there has been a lot of protest against it. Secondly, there has been ignored warning. In 2013, there was an academic article warning of Sikkim's fragile glacial and highlighting risk in this area. but this has been ignored, as well as ICMOT report, because Sikkim is UNESCO World Heritage Site. There has been multiple reports done there, and they also identified 100 of potentially dangerous glacial lake, and that has also been ignored. Thirdly, there has been geopolitical challenges, and since 1967's Nathula Pass, Chola Pass conflict, plus 2017 Doklam clash between between China, Bhutan, and Sikkim, India, there has been extensive militarization. There has been construction of road, bunkers. If here's anyone from Sikkim, probably from the northern part of Sikkim, you must have been aware how from 2018 there has been overnight a lot of tankers, military tank traveling, ruining entire road, making very difficult for the local people to commute even to the capital city, which is like 3 hour away. And finally, there has been a rapid urbanization today. If you come to Sikkim, you will see one of the most biggest mall in the heart of Gangtok, which is a ticking time bomb, as every local would say. And there has been over tourism within Sikkim, considering how much the land has been in crisis, and we can hear in news every day, or tourists has been washed away, or there has been roadblocks, and there has been like 10 hour, 20 hour of roadblocks or and traffic congestion, because of which people cannot even commute normally. So after the glacial lake outburst happened, I tried, after like 9 days, 10 days, I got in touch with my mom and I asked her, so what's going on? How are you doing? Or how's the situation? And she answered me with a proverb again. She said, Ba ba gisampozo, which means every bamboo makes the bridge. Now, if you remember from my first, the categorization of the proverb, I talk about tikpasana gyamsoko, which means every drops makes the ocean. That's very popular also in English, or in Hindi we say like boon boon se sagar banta hai, or boon boon sagar banati hai, right? So in Bhutia also we have tikpasana gyamsoko. But in this new situation, in this new environmental crisis, my mother came up with a very new way of explaining like how each bamboo makes the bridge. And that was directly referring to, in the northern part of Sikkim, near my, it's just next to my village, is how local people have built this bamboo cane bridge, which was an indigenous knowledge to how to make this bridge. And they started to do this. And second example was how Indian armies were so actively trying to do the rescue project, helping the local community. Usually, local community doesn't have very high regard for Indian armies, I must confess. But after the flood, what happens is one of my cousin, he was telling me that Lama Kagyu mi Shimpu Yaden, which means monk who himself doesn't know attempts to deliver another soul. And this was, I thought it was told in the face of that monk, like the Indian army, they themselves are dying, but they still try to protect the people. But I later on, by probing much more, I found out that it was actually in a positive light, that even though Indian armies themselves were in trouble, they still came out to help the locals. So in that way, the proverb shows also the change in attitude from not so positive to maybe averagely positive. And another example is from one of my neighboring auntie. She was telling that Bilon de to keke ajutsu share na yoke tapagyale, which means an experienced and knowledgeable man is far superior to 100 greedy and selfish monk. And this was specifically referring to hundreds of junior engineers that Sikkim is producing this year, in these days, in recent years, that they failed to even build a proper road or proper infrastructure in Sikkim, whereas the knowledge and the wisdom of the older generation of building, either it's about building the bridge, or even when the road were cut off, Sikkim was cut off from Siliguri, most of the food was provided from the nature. They went to forest again, they started to revive their knowledge, they started to collect fern, they started to collect nettle plants, and they started to prepare olden dish. There has been also article about this in a very recent times by Mona Chetri. And this is how people adapted.
Sorry, Kiki, I think you get another 3 minutes maximum.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is how people adapted to the changing situation. So I'll avoid that. So when we look at proverb in the environment in the policy section, we see that Border Road Organization has already been starting to utilize proverb in so many cautionary and moral guidance way, and that are now reinterpreted to reflect current environmental anxieties, such as we can see like after whiskey, driving is risky. I'm sure if you have traveled to the Himalayan region, either Ladakh or Sikkim or anywhere in Arunachal, you have seen these road signs, and I had more road signs for fun purposes. But we will move quickly to the afterthought that in the aftermath of 2023 clocks, Sikkimese proverbs, how they readapted, illustrates how communities reinterpret disaster through familiar idioms, transforming trauma into teachable, transmissible, and collectively owned knowledge. Thus, the Sikkimese response to the Gulf crisis or even any form of disaster crisis through proverb making exemplifies how oral tradition or cultural sustainability and resilience are deeply interconnected. In contrast to purely technical or policy response, these cultural expressions offer a bottom up, which is deeply contextual understanding of how to recover from a disaster and how to survive. And they represent not only how people endure, but how they continue to find meaning, connections, and agency amid uncertainty. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kiki. I think that was a very valuable presentation. I think we will try and reflect on that towards the end, perhaps. So now I request the second speaker, Dr. Deepti Tamang. She will be speaking on understanding disaster. Is sustainable development feasible? Narratives from the Himalaya.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes,
Okay, thank you.
yes, yes,
I
yes.
will try sharing my screen. Is it visible?
No, not yet. Yes, yes, now it's visible. Yes.
Okay. So,
You
first of
can
all,
go for full screen. Full screen.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's working. So, very good evening to everyone, and thank you, Debarati and the team for having me on board and accommodating to my needs on such a short notice as well. Without taking much time, I'm going to be diving straight into my presentation today. And thank you, Dr. Kiki, for setting up the tone. And I think that was very informative and in detail, which is so my presentation is sort of going to be like a continuation from where Kiki left off. And this is going to be from the other side of the Tista. So I think geographically, for those of us unaware of the region, this entire region sort of falls under the Eastern Himalayan belt, which comprises of Sikkim, Darjeeling, Northeast, and then a certain extent of Eastern Nepal. So in the past few years, what we will see is that there has been extensive questions, discussions, and deliberations around what is idea of development or the model of development and how ecologically feasible or not it has been for these places. Clearly, because of a lot of difficulties, and immediately to begin with, I think it was with a significant change in the kind of climate hazards that we were facing, rising temperature, and generally these regions. And I will be speaking from the vantage point of Kalimpong and Darjeeling, which is different from Sikkim, and it is part of West Bengal, because the confusion geographically is also always around these regions being clubbed as part of the Northeast, but actually it's very separate and different, and the only connection remains the national highway, a picture of which is available here, and the condition at present, which continues to deteriorate much over a period of time. So today, when I will be talking about disaster and sustainable development, my presentation is more like interrogation and questions taken from the narratives of what is happening in the grassroots level of people, families, and stories of people who are facing the challenges of what has happened after 2023. And it continues to worsen. Even as I speak, we've been having incessant rainfall for the past 2, 3 days, and the highway is again damaged in multiple places. And the questions of insecurities and risk is again at a whole different high. So this is what the kind of situation that has now developed for these places. And I think I would like to begin with a short story. So this is going to be very different from the presentation that Kiki just gave, which allows us to get a very important insight in terms of theory and policies and the discussions around these realities. And what I bring in is also sort of like stories from the places, narratives, because I feel that whenever we talk about policies and deliberations, we are still talking at levels which include stakeholders that are at a level which is somewhat disconnected from the grassroots, which is reflected in the conditions and the afterlives of the people on this side of the Tista in the highway region. So to begin with, in 2024, I was attending one of a arts festival which was organized by Indian Foundation for the Arts in Bangalore, and I was part of it as a former research grantee of one of the projects that I had done with them. And I met and I was introduced to a group of young boys, which was called the Tista Troopers. And this is like a small band of young boys that has come up after the Tista disaster, which was mentored by another popular band, which is called Gaule Bhai, and they are based in Bangalore. And they use their music as a form of storytelling, bringing the lived realities and experiences of the place and stories and connecting it with these larger questions that we often tend to see in terms of theories. So my interaction with these guys gave me a whole different reality check, despite the fact that I belong from this place and I still am part of this place, and which gave me an insight into how disconnected I was from the realities that affect the lives of the people who are still located in these places. So after 2023, and what happened was when we had the glove, and it was a disaster of a really large scale, which was something that the hills had not witnessed. Because if you will look into the depth and follow up on Kiki's presentation, it has been a very pertinent question that has been the people of the hills have been forced to confront in the past few years in terms of the kind of models of development that has been taking place and the changes that we can see. This has been glaringly so in terms of the national hydropower project that has come up in the region. And when it was first started, it was very, very strongly opposed by a small group of minorities, which is led by the Lepcha people who are based in Zongo, and who their protest was political, but it was coming from a very important place of what the environment means to them, what the Tista means to them, and to the people of the Himalayas, and how these regions, for people and communities of these places, it is not just the river, it is not just the mountains, but how over years these communities have lived in interconnection, integrated with these places. And it has not just been sources of livelihood or, part of our lives, but also in terms of how sacred these places have been. So the question that was being asked and raised when this project was first being proposed was in terms of what it meant for the changes that would be brought about in the community, how it would affect the traditional style of living, how it would affect this very important integration of community culture with the place, and what would this kind of development mean for the people of the place. But it was obviously shut down very, very forcefully by the state, and there is immense documentation in terms of what followed after that, and the project was put into place. But over a period of time, what we have been witnessing is also as part of the larger changes that has been coming about globally in terms of the global change that has been happening. And we have been witnessing erratic climatic conditions. We have been witnessing increasing rise in temperature. We've been witnessing a lot of changes, which is not synonymous with the lifestyle that has been in the mountain regions. And these have been matters of concern for some time. But it and just locating it in terms of everyday conversations and practices within the community, we have always heard and grown up in, and we hear these conversations in terms of how by default, without even much knowledge or even without knowing the details of theoretically or in larger precise terms, the connection would always be drawn back to the changes that was brought about by this kind of projects being implemented. And so this was a disaster which was bound to happen. And this was a disaster which all of us were sort of prepared for, but not so soon and not so fast and not in the intensity with which it happened. So last October, again, going back to these young boys, what happened was when I was talking to them and I met them, they told me about how what is the reality of the community who have been living along the Tista Basin in the highway, which is a long stretch of highway that you can see when you enter this part of the region. That there has been a massive now. For me, it was very important, and it was also a reflection in terms of the policies that were being taken and decisions being taken at a higher level, and the disconnect with the realities of the people at the lower level. So what happened after the 2023 disaster was the story on the side of Sikkim versus on the side of West Bengal was completely different, because also in terms of, which is where I come in with my intervention in terms of questioning or asking questions about rehabilitation measures and disaster management systems. So I remember that a young colleague of mine had just joined Majitar, a college in Majitar, Manipal Institute of Technology, and he had just reported that night when the disaster took place. And he called me up at 4 a.m. in the morning, telling me about how he was witnessing the rise of the Tista and how they had been evacuated, and how there was a system in place on the other side of the Tista where evacuation measures were in place and people were evacuated. And what followed after that was also a very systematic manner in which the disaster was first recognized as a disaster and rehabilitation measures were put into place. And the way the families were evacuated, measures were taken to take care. And of course, there's loopholes in those systems and policies there also. But what happened on this side of the Tista was how politics comes in play in terms of the different stakeholders at different levels, and how this has also worked out with the model of development to worsen the situation for the people who've been living on the banks of the Tista. So what I have here is also a series of photos which I would like to share with all of you, so that more than words, it gives us a glimpse and insight into what was documented immediately after the follow up by a group of people and young people who had gone to document this on their own. So I would just like to begin by sharing that. So these are some of the glimpses, and this is exactly what the situation was at that time, and it continues to remain even now. And you will see how the situation has worsened. These are some of the houses which is on the banks of the Tista, on the side which goes from which connects Kalimpong to Darjeeling. And this is also the situation many people still continue to live. Just a few weeks ago, the same team of people had gone to revisit this place, and they had also gone to sort of check and follow up on what happened. What happened immediately after the disaster was that a lot of people, groups came up, a lot of existing system was put into place where community members were involved in providing support systems, providing relief materials, providing help to the people. And what has always been a condition in terms of how things have operated in Darjeeling Hills, which has had its own difficult relationship with the state, which has always been in a state of political turmoil because of its questions of identity and questions of the statehood movement, and how this has impacted the kind of policies and decisions that has been taken up and followed up after, before, and during the course of period of time over the past few years regarding the idea of development in the state. Now, this has rightly been questioned also and written about in depth by people and scholars who've been working in the field and intersection of environment and economy and development. People, scholars like Pona Chetri and others have done a very good work in terms of asking these very important questions. What these images reflect and what these show is asking us very important questions now as people and of this part of the region, and also as citizens, that over a period of time, like Kiki also mentioned, that we have seen the kind of model of development that has been put into place is mimicking a certain kind of development model which comes from the West, and which is also being aggressively pushed forward by not just in these regions but in India at a national level also. And we have seen the disasters and consequences in ecologically fragile regions like other parts of the Himalayas, in the Western Himalayas, where Uttarakhand and places like Himachal have already been in the center of these disasters, where landslides and floods and uh, cloud bursts have been an integral part of the kind of disasters that have taken place over a period of time. And now this the Glacier Lake outburst flood, which took place in Sikkim in 2023, which started in South Lonak Lake in Sikkim, which is at a altitude of 17,300 feet, and which was a huge disaster of an unprecedented scale. Even then, what we did witness was that the question then arises is that was it a natural disaster or was it man-made? And this was for the first time that in the discourse of development, in the discourse of this model of development that was being pushed aggressively into these places, that these questions were being raised by what does sustainable development mean for places like this? When we began with these constructions, what started with the NHPC construction, which was one of the most huge and major construction at that time, which has now been followed thereafter by also the introduction of the railway system, precisely because the highways have become fragile and there has been a need to develop an alternate transport system. Now, the irony is that the highway has become very, very fragile over the last period of years, and people in these regions, for the whenever the monsoon sets in, it's like 4 or 5 months is of immense difficulty and hardships for people, where it is connected, these regions are completely cut off from the remaining mainland, where these places are very dependent on Siliguri, for instance, for a lot of produce and products, and the highway being the chicken neck corridor which connects these regions to the rest of India. So whenever there is monsoon and when there is these 4 periods means immense difficulty for people from these places, which causes a lot of hardships given the fact that these are regions which have to be dependent on Siliguri for not just economic purposes, but also for health and other facilities. So this has forced not just the community people, but also policy makers to now be pressurized to ask, like, what kind of model of development is actually feasible. And if we see and look at the idea of sustainable development as it has been laid down in the SDG goals, the intersection of environment and the ecological cost of it is today at a new high, where global climate change has forced policymakers and stakeholders to question this at not just the local level but at national and global level. And obviously there has been much more emphasis and importance is being laid in terms of working with the community. But what we did witness and what we have witnessed is that oral traditions and practices of community-based lifestyles, indigenous communities, which have, for instance, in regions like the mountains, where these communities have revered the mountains, the rivers, and they've worshipped these places, and they've always followed a lifestyle and pattern which has been in sync with the larger nature. But what happens then when this kind of a discourse is brought to the table is that it is often dismissed or it is often repressed, and these people who are the ones who are actually directly affected by these changes are the ones who are kept outside of these discourses. So whenever we talk about any idea of sustainability, or when we are talking about sustainable development where the emphasis is on too much at this point of time, the question then to be asked is it possible or is it even feasible to have sustainability where the main stakeholders are kept out of these discourses, where traditional knowledge keepers who actually have a much more richer, nuanced, and in-depth understanding of how communities have survived for centuries with these places and how it has been in sync, does it form as informative sources of knowledge or knowledge systems from which policies can be deciphered? And that is something I feel and other scholars feel scholars and others have also pointed out, and there's been an emphasis on oral traditions and cultures and histories now, perhaps because of this recognition of this importance of the symbiotic relationship between these two aspects, which has to be in the heart of policy making for these places. Otherwise, when we talk about sustainability, what does it come at? And especially for places like Darjeeling, for instance, where the politics of the place, like I've mentioned, has been in the heart of the place for a very, very long time, which has a very different history in comparison to Sikkim, for instance, which is an independent state. Now, at this point of time, when you look at this side, and when I was talking to the young boys, the Tista troopers, what they highlighted was, and how they've been constantly demanding for basic stuff as rehabilitation, which was supposed to be given to them, which was released by the state, but which never reached the people, the stakeholders at the lower level, because of the politics and
Sorry,
multiple stakeholders.
Dr. Deepti, another 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Yeah.
So this is where we are at the crossroads, not just in terms of understanding these questions in terms of, the theoretical level, or at how do we decipher this, but how intersections of environment, ecology, communities, and politics play a very important role in first defining what development means, and then asking the question of, at the cost of what are we pushing forward for this kind of development, and what continues to remain the aftermath of this development. So I would like to close my presentation here and maybe have a much more better deliberations in the discussions and Q&A. Thank you so much.
I think both the presentations were quite fascinating, requiring a lot of in-depth reflections. So let's have the third presentation. Dr. Anupa Anushri, and the title of her presentation, Disasters Democracy, Democracy of Disaster, Political Sustainability in Times of Crisis. So I think, yeah, we're waiting for a very interesting
Right.
title topic. Yeah, please go
Yeah,
ahead.
a picture abhi baki hai. Let me try to share the screen. This is a new computer I'm working on, so if I have a glitch, please forgive me for that. Anyway, I have just shared this window. Oh God, what did I do? And I'm not very familiar with Google Meet. Is it okay if I don't share a slideshow? I mean, I don't use a lot of I use visual material.
Maybe you
to
could
make a point.
forward your slides to Dhitiman, and he
I
might
could do
be able
that.
to. Yeah.
Yes. So I'm very glad that I'm presenting after the two speakers, because both these speakers highlighted the role of narrative and politics in constructing what we call as disaster. And as a political historian, I'm interested in both of these aspects of thinking about disaster. I do want to stress that this particular way of thinking about disaster, as something that's, I'm sorry.
Sorry,
Uh,
Deepti, I think you should be muting yourself.
uh, so just give me one moment. I'll just forward this to Jitiman. Yeah, so this way of thinking about disasters as something that has a particular narrative that's marked by a specific temporality and is defined by a certain way of certain disruption, intense disruption. So a magnitude of disruption is very critical to thinking about disasters. That I cannot right now get into, but it's an interesting sort of concept to think about the temporality of disaster. Why do we think of disaster in terms of specific time scale and in terms of specific intensity? A disaster is not a catastrophe and it's not a crisis. So it's somewhere in between. And I do want to think very broadly about the relationship between disaster and human accountability. And this is why I think the two presenters before me did a stellar job in making us think about disasters as not necessarily an organic or natural phenomena, but rather something that has a human element to it, that's defined by relationship of humanity, of human civilization with nature. I also think that it's important for us to think not just to think about disasters not just from the present vantage point. Of course, the present moment presents a very interesting cusp, as Deepti mentioned, between technology, between science, between humanity, humanism, and nature. A lot of what gets obscured in these scientific explorations or scientific presentations of disaster is, again, like I'm saying, the role of human agency in shaping what we consider as the natural event, as a natural disaster. And therefore, to go back into history and thinking about how historical actors, how historical figures dealt with climate crisis or climate change is something very interesting and something that I've not done so far, except in a tangential way. I would welcome your questions and feedback on my presentation. Before I begin my presentation, I do want to acknowledge and thank the organizers for putting together this excellent panel. And I'm glad you got two wonderful women speakers to highlight, the kind of persuasion we need to think about disaster, not just as a phenomena that requires masculine, quote unquote, masculine slash scientific intervention, but also something that's much more feminine, much more connected and associated with care, with community, with collectivity. So I'm a political historian, and I do think that disasters also reveal very specific sort of disruption or very specific sort of momentum towards either democratization or de-democratization. And I think for most part of Western scholarship has been focused on, and in fact, it has been increasingly being reproduced in Indian scholarship too. A lot of scholarship today focuses on how disasters disrupt democracies, how they fracture and splinter notions of citizenship. And I do want to sort of push back against that sort of theory of thinking about disasters as disruptive. Of course, disasters are materially disruptive. Disasters tend to lead to enduring damage of property and human life. That's not the point I'm making. I think I'm interested in thinking about how disasters also promote and generate democratic sensibilities or sensibilities or attitudes towards solidarity, towards companionship, towards care, like I was saying earlier. And so I think democracies and disaster, despite our ostensible beliefs, share a deep resonance. Of course, like I mentioned, one way of thinking about disasters, the parallels between disasters and democracy is to think how disasters splinter and fracture citizenship. But I believe that there is more need, like Kiki and Deepti's work tell us, more need for us to think about how disasters promote a certain democratic sensibility. And to jump to my particular presentation, I want to move on to thinking about the connections between development and disasters. And like disasters, development has often been narrated as inevitable and organic, something that's natural to certain parts of the world. And similar to disasters, developmental regimes also fracture democratic sensibility by creating conditional citizenship, making economic participation a fundamental criterion of inclusion. Development involves massive dislocation of people and traditions, and development is not just an economic activity, but also an emotive, ideological, and ecological phenomenon, which involves disciplining workers into productive labor, training them into specific ideologies. And so here in this presentation, I'm looking at this specific case, historical situation where which involved a specific development project of a massive dam across a highly disruptive river. This is Kosi Barrage, which was conceptualized in 1950s. It was being deliberated by scientists, by engineers since the late 19th century, but it's eventually conceptualized and inaugurated in 1954. And so 1955 is when this barrage comes up. And it is in the sort of this nebulous, geographically nebulous zone between Nepal and Bihar. I argue that the construction of this dam presents a particular challenge in thinking about the relationship between developmental regimes and labor and democracy. Um, and I would be happy to ruminate more on this during the Q&A, but for now, let me come back to the project that showcases how the politics of development also created opportunities for economic capture by state actors, leading to traumatizing the relationship between the Indian state and the labor. And so this is a very rough presentation of Kosi Dam, Kosi River, which actually, like I mentioned, is not just in a very nebulous zone, ecologically nebulous zone, but it's also considered one of the most sort of volatile rivers, and it always migrates. So you can see in this map here, the river migrates about 200 kilometers between 1731 to 1963. This is the catchment area of the river in Bihar. I am not included a map of Nepal, which is actually much more interesting because the eastern part of Kosi is very volatile in Nepal. It's much more volatile than in Bihar, and therefore this is it's the sobriquet that was provided to the river by Nehru was because it caused a lot of flooding, and to this day the most recent ghastly flooding was in 2008, but day every season Kosi floods number of villages, causing massive destruction of life and property. And so I focus on a very specific moment in the construction of Kosi embankment. So there were these phase-wise construction of Kosi Dam, and I'd request Dhritiman to on slide number 4, because I'm still sort of like drawing on the larger point about river changing its course and the kind of developmental regime that manipulated this river into presenting the development of dam as something of a total panacea for the region. And so this paper brings together two very disparate themes, labor and corruption. I examined the historical constitution of voluntary labor, which were called as Shramdanis, its mobilization for the Kosi project, and the corrupt racket which was established and controlled by Bharat Seva Sangha and its associates Ellen Mishra and Lahatan Chaudhary, to demonstrate the ways in which corruption traumatized labor's relationship with the Indian state. I will not have time to delve into the intricacies of the case I'm studying, but I do want to leave you with some basic questions on why it is essential for us to discuss histories of developmentalism, especially in the case of South Asia, and why I think all political histories need to consider how developmentalism changed the way people practiced politics in the global South. Developmental paradigms, like I mentioned before, dislocate and dismember democracy's promise of inclusion and equality and pit the category of labor, in this instance, against another category of citizenship. And one of the best and the most recent examples of this is the COVID-19 crisis, which has also been presented as a disaster, right? Almost universally, one could see citizenship in tension with labor, where demands of work and employment continue to undermine basic citizenship demands of health and food. And this is not all. Citizenship and labor are especially in tension when developmental paradigms are in peripheral economic zones, such as Nepal in South Asia and Bihar in India. And a different iteration of the paper, I discuss this in greater detail. I go into how different political actors, both in Nepal and in India at the time, federal political actors, considered Nepal as peripheral to the broader developmental approach to South Asia, including some international actors. Development demands negotiation through an elite group. Sometimes it could be male upper castes, sometimes those who have scientific education, and to use a term by Michael Sandel, credentialed elites, and in case of India, all three at the same time. But it is usually a group of people at the top who control and determine what development is and how it is supposed to be achieved. And this is very apparent in Deepti's presentation. Therefore, development fractures democracy. Development always leads to a hierarchization of society into experts and non-experts, actors and receivers of development, because it creates models of inclusion and exclusion based on this hierarchy. And I'll be happy to elaborate on what are some of the theoretical sources that I'm drawing from when I'm talking about inclusion and exclusion based on developmental regimes. And in this paper, I argue that developmental paradigms dislocated labor, fragmented labor into hierarchies of formal and informal work, and traumatized labor's relationship with citizenship. And this is where this is the Sobriquet Sorrow Bihar, the river migrates. The first phase of construction of Kosi occurred in between 1954, when it was inaugurated, to around 1960s, to early 1960s. That's the phase that I focus on. India had just gained independence. There was a lot of momentum around constructing big dams. And in fact, Daniel Clinton Smith, one of very well-known scholars of development in the global south, has shown through a very detailed study of various countries across the global south that there were about 45,000 large dams that were constructed in different parts of Asia and Africa, mostly with the support of international organizations like United Nations Development Program, and all of those affiliated organizations. And of course, creation of hydraulic resources such as Kosi, but the big one was, of course, Bhakra and Nangal Dam, which Nehru calls as the temple of modern India. Those controlling these hydraulic sources was very critical to projecting national power, especially for a nascent country like India. Like I mentioned, projecting this national power, this national aspiration, was a road to creating a secular, modern habitus, political habitus. But as I was mentioning this before, Kosi project was also a projection of domestic power hierarchies. The Kosi River and Indo-Nepal border did not align with any significant neighbor. Nepal was considerably low in Indian geostrategic priority than Pakistan, and nor did Kosi's main catchment state in India, Bihar, matter to the developmental imaginations of India. This provisional temperament to nation building was part of a broader sensibility of labeling people and communities in terms of their scientific contribution, and very much a piece of the developmental mindset that shaped Indian history in the immediate aftermath of independence. And this is, can you, Dhritiman, please move to slide 6, which is a picture of V.V. Giri, who was also the president of India, but a prominent figure in Indian politics in early 1950s. And he was also the labor minister for a time. And he admitted that India had the enormous challenge of training masses unworthy of industrialization into labor. Nehru, who wrote the foreword for Giri's scientific assessment of labor issues, set the tone for labor hierarchies by suggesting that rationalization and ideological cooperation of labor was imperative for changing the future of the country. This association of labor with national temporality, with national developmentalism, was also a demand for rapid reallocation of labor on the hierarchical scale of scientific and efficient on one hand, and backward and productive on the other. Remarking on the significance of the project in disciplining labor, the then Congress leader and Minister for Planning, Irrigation and Power, Gulzari Lal Nanda, who was also, again, a prominent politician in the Nehru cabinet, eulogized the use of surplus labor in the service of in the service of the nation. And that's when the politics moves from not only thinking about...
Dr. Anupa, could we wrap it up in another 3 minutes?
Yes, I'll try to summarize this within 3 minutes, which is basically to track the sort of politics of how to categorize labor into scientific, rational workforce and workers who were not educated, who were not worthy of industrialization. And to that, another prominent politician, like I was saying, Gulzari Lal Nanda, created this organization called Bharat Sevak Sangha. And Dhritiman, could you please move to slide 8? And Nanda secures around 500,000 men to actually to create this Bharat Sevak Samaj. He mobilizes around 500,000 men who are going to contribute, who are considered as a voluntary labor force, who are not paid salaries, who are supposed to contribute to the making of this dam, Kosi Dam. Bharat Sevak Samaj was also associated with Bharat Sadhu Samaj, which was another sort of esoteric organization, which is roughly translated as Indian Ascetic Society. And these Shramdanis were basically supposed to sacrifice for the purposes of national developmentalism. But when there is when this organization starts mobilizing people to actually work on the dam, what occurs is a huge corruption scandal, because a lot of these volunteers were supposed to contribute 10% of what they were earning. First of all, they were volunteers, so they were not getting a salary. They were actually, some of them were paying out of their own pockets to be there. And the corruption occurs when 10% of what their work is supposed to be, that government contributes for their work, is siphoned off. Even that 10% is siphoned off by these ministers, Latan Chaudhary and Ellen Mishra. And I don't want to, again, get into the intricacies of the case, because I don't think I have that kind of time, and I'd be happy to elaborate on this during my Q&A. But suffice it to say that it was precisely this corruption scandal and the kind of immunity that was provided to Bharat Sevak Samaj because of its projection as a service, as a voluntary service to national cause, that this corruption scandal could be carried forward with impunity, and there was absolutely no investigation of the scandal. There was a investigation committee that was established in 1973, B.L. Kapoor committee, but that committee actually ends up just producing a very, very simplistic report of the grand scale of corruption that occurred in this instance. And what was surprising was the kind of obscuring of human cost of this corruption scandal. And to conclude, I will kind of go over what I've talked about, which is conceived in seismically and ecologically fragile zone of Indo-Nepal border. The corruption in Kosi project was exacerbated by its geostrategic inferiority to India. Its presence in one of the most impoverished states in India intensified its framing as a pedagogical campaign in training of illiterate masses into voluntaristic citizenship. And much of this pedagogical element of the project was underlined in the way Bihari and Nepali workers were treated as unworthy subjects of a grand vision of a developing democracy. And this paper is an exploration of the ways in which corruption impacts labor's relationship with the state. In the scenario, we discussed the brief construction history of Kosi embankment. Corruption involved not merely embezzling of property, but actually attenuation of the citizen workers' demands on the Indian state. Eulogized as Shramdanis, these voluntary workers were disabled from making any claims on the state because of their supposed commitment to national duty. When the Shramdanis eventually started asserting their rights as citizens, they were presented as freeloaders and petty profiteers. The construction of labor as pious responsibility was directly associated with narratives of governance as religious duty and directly contravened the promise of secular and constitutional citizenship. Ultimately, the most damning corruption of democracy occurs, as Cicero observed, when morality replaces law. And I'll conclude with that, and I welcome discussion and feedback.
Okay, so thank you very much. I think all the three presentations were extremely fascinating, I must say, especially coming from the discipline of economics. I find them, extremely fascinating because of the kind of demystification of the whole modernity, the ideas of rationality associated with the hegemonic notions of development, which go with the techno-managerial ideas, with how development gets defined and driven, and how, for instance, the ideas of community itself are seen, in not so respectable terms coming from the developmental, thinking in the hegemonic sense of the term. and how, for instance, the whole ideas of proverbs in the first paper. I thought that the way that it connects is actually in terms of the debates that we have in the sense of learning about multiplicity of metrics. The way that modern neoliberal developmental orientation has reduced the very meaning of development to a singularity, and how what might seem like the proverbial statements, which seem quite contradictory and contextual, however, carry a lot of that contextual knowledge, which is just not possible in the way that you usually do development in a straight-jacketed, universalized, generalized terms, where how. For instance, a variety of valuations, alternative valuations. I think the second paper brought up, notions of sacredness, ways of life, heritage. Now, these kinds of values, which are quite incommensurable, they simply can't be reflected in the monetary, valuations and metrics, which are usually the kind of cost-benefit based ideas. Because of which, what happens in the third paper, as well as I think the second paper also brought up the suppression of protests, the way that democracy depletes, how the top-down kind of model operates, and far from actually appreciating the knowledge and incorporating it into the development process, the notions of development, how, for instance, it brings up corruption, which perhaps is not quite there in the in the community. And this top-down model, therefore, perhaps brings up a lot of problems and challenges. But I would perhaps, as to just trigger off a debate, also wonder how these development projects get carried forward, because we know that parts of these communities also associate themselves with the developmental projects. It's not as if the entire community opposes it. So this and this has been the problematic with the communitarian framing, that it misses out in some sense on the political economy within, that communities are also hierarchized, and that there are elites within the community, that the elites side with these notions of development. They do get benefits, and it's quite at the expense of those that are more vulnerable within the community. So therefore, I think these ideas of how the state is fractured, the community is fractured, how it is hierarchized, how therefore the costs and benefits and the injustice perhaps is borne by certain sections. So I think those are perhaps reflections which have not come up as sharply perhaps as they ought to have, because I know that from one vantage point we're confronting the hegemon, but from another vantage point we also are suffering from a certain vulnerability of the epistemic that we would like to carry through. So I think these are the reflections that we might have to have as part of the questions. Now I open the floor for questions. Anybody can just unmute themselves and please raise your question.
If there are no questions, can I just start with? Yeah. So this is basically a question to both, the panelists from, Sikkim and Darjeeling, especially, I mean, this is the point that Vijay sir has already raised. I think this is the question, what is the community response to, when we are focusing on afterlife of a disaster, what is really the community response? And by that, what I mean is, of course, a civil society response, because the question of resistance or dissent, for that matter, this should serve some kind of, rootedness also, right? I mean, while we are discussing, how afterlife is unpacking, what kind of resilience stories of or narratives of resilience are manifesting, we also need to think about what sort of mobilizations can really, take place, or whether they have taken place already. So this is one question to both of you. And then Anubhas, yeah, it's really a very interesting presentations. I think you have spoken about, as a political historian, of course, you are focusing on the various chapters of the history. Would you like to relate some of these with the kind of scenes that manifested from recent anti-dam movements in India as well? I mean, this has also a very interesting political economy, with because recently I did one field work here in Malda, and I realized that the political establishment is really very pro disaster. Basically, they want these refugees to be made all the time, because they have certain kind of leverage to play out, because these are the people, the surplus population of development, who are then being used for so many political activities. So I was just wondering, what sort of connection is there between the again the politics and really this environmental refugee.
If I
Yeah,
may
that,
go ahead
yeah.
and if I may go ahead and answer to what Vijay and the Stiman professor were talking, questioning about. I think in context of Sikkim also, when we talked about hydropower project dams, there are discussions within the community about how Lepcha communities are more against it, and how some of the Bhutia communities in the northern part of Sikkim are completely, for it. And there has been conflict between these communities about implications of such disaster and what has happened now, and we need to stop it, things like that. But in terms of talking from more grounded perspective, I would say it's more related to economy. For example, most of the people who are protesting are educated, and their lands are not directly falling under the NHPC dam that are taken away. And the people who are supporting it are those little bit less educated probably, and their lands, their huge amount of lands are falling in the category of, okay, this area will become the NHPC dam. So the people who wants to give this is also simultaneously connected to the idea of how Sikkimese society has also evolved into more materialistic, in a way that there are lots of weddings and there are lots of events coming up, and they need to financially also be able to match up to the requirement of the social pressure, and then they do not have any new income. So the best income is to be able to sell this land off and then sustain their reputation, sustain their position within the community. So it's very intertwined in a way that it's not only one dimensional, that okay, protection of nature, protection of environment, it's not only that, but also sustaining the current scenario within the socio political economic structures of how we are able to contribute back to the society that has been moving so fast materialistically, and in so many regards. Upon saying that, another leverage is also that people, when they are when there has been bluff and the aftermath of it, when we were talking about some of the community members, I wouldn't say Lachin Lachun, because there has been more, or Chumthang, because there has been more personal losses of property and damages. But in the areas that were not directly affected by bluff, they would rather say that, oh, because these things happened because of the actions of the hydropower project dams, and it affected the people who were not involved in this, right? So they are trying to also create a narrative that remove themselves from the direct eventual result of the bluff, or even the victimization of the bluff. And they would rather remove themselves from either participating in it or suffering from it. And I'm talking about the regions that were not directly affected. Thank you.
DP, do you want to
I
come?
think, we need perhaps new categories, literate, uneducated, illiterate, educated, kind of complexity of it. And especially in the post-disaster context, I wonder how, somebody can just, and that's precisely what is happening even in my discipline, that 2008 crisis happens, and I, still cannot really displace the microeconomics in the classroom. So I think, yes, these are the challenges that one is facing. But somewhere down the line, the idea of how these hegemonic forces manage to co-opt the communities and how people do fall for, and that is the kind of internal contradiction that one has to really face, because people do also seek some ideas of mobility, some notions of development. So therefore, it's not as if communities are completely averse to accumulation, but where do we draw the line is where the problem arrives, and how people, once they get co-opted, they lose control, as I think one of the panelists has already said. The whole idea of participative democracy is taken over top down by the techno-managerial notions of rationality and how projects are therefore designed and implemented. And people hardly have any role there. I think this whole process, therefore, needs to be reflected, in depth in terms of concretely, documenting this whole narrative and how the narrative sustains despite the kind of completely unsustainable experiences on the ground. So I think there's that very fascinating kind of a terrain which these presentations have created for further research.
Can I jump in here, Dhritimant?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to your very provocative and then also Kiki's very thought-provoking response, which is to think about the broader language of developmentalism, right? The broader language of developmentalism itself is designed to promote and legitimize this kind of polarity. You would have communities which would sort of, as you're saying, co-opt, whether they are intentionally co-opted or whether they are co-opted by natural causes, historical forces, what have you. That's besides the point. But there is a way in which this very narrative of developmentalism as something organic, as something inevitable, as something natural, is designed to promote and legitimize this polarity between us and them. This creation of binary itself is problematic. And I do not necessarily have a response or solution to this kind of binary which has imbued even my language and my research projects. But a different iteration of the paper actually examines an iteration of paper that I did not have time to get into in any detailed way here. Examines precisely what you were talking about, which is how do we think about labor not in this monolithic term, but rather labor's association with these ecologically fragile projects led to creation of these actually different categories of labor, where certain kinds of labor was considered more, beneficial for the project. They were considered to be more worthy of compensation, more worthy of even media talk when this corruption scandal emerged. While other kinds of labor, the kinds of labor which was not necessarily, educated or illiterate, or they did not have this necessary expertise, scientific expertise, was considered as surplus, as not, worthy of even compensation. So how do I think, as humanists, our language should not necessarily be just about examining these binaries, that not just examining the ways in which community has been, deployed in projects, in our sort of reading of these projects, these developmental projects, but also to see how these broader framing, broader framing of developmental projects itself is a way of creating these fissures between, literate labor, expertise, and non-experts. And can we produce, consistent, not necessarily a historically consistent, because every development project comes with its own complication of different scientific expertise, of mobilization of different kinds of labor and knowledge. I do think that at some point we need to think about how these sort of developmental regimes themselves reinforce these categories and also draw legitimacy from them. That's my one sort of like response to you. So not fetishizing community, I take that point very seriously, and I think I respond to that provocation very well in my broader written work. I do think it's important to pay attention to how historically situated that logic is also, because colonialism was nothing but try to fetishize one kind of native elite agency over, other kinds of relationships with nature, for example, or gendered relations and whatnot, and also political relations. Um, and then, would you like me to continue to Jyotiman's? Is it okay if I continue to Jyotiman's question?
Yes, yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. So yeah, I don't particularly have any anecdotes about anti-dam events, but there's been a lot of very interesting scholarship emerging from Latin America. I think that's where a good amount of thinking about community relationships with ecology and their intersection with very big financially motivated, internationally legitimized, scientifically promoted projects, developmental projects are coming from. And these intersections of scholarship, but also political activism, is a very important sort of space to start with. We cannot today think of these scholarships as objective in any way. I do think that our scholarship should reflect a certain element of advocacy, a certain element of political positioning very directly as far as this intersection between a certain kind of scientific expertise and environmental exploitation is going on in Latin America. In fact, a number of very good friends of mine have been at the forefront of both advocating and showing scientifically how these supposedly developmental projects are actually going to have very devastating impact on the environment in the long term. And I think that's where the next frontier of scholarship should emerge from. So again, not having an anecdote, but thinking about Indian scholarship, I think there's also very interesting niche scholarship emerging from this sort of intersection between thinking about there's a lot of fetishization of objectivity in scientific literature, right? That has started to be being questioned and challenged by these niche group of scholars. Kaveri, there was a recent conflict that I'm sure most of you would be aware of between Tamil Nadu and Karnataka on Kaveri River. Narmada River was another sort of like such a, there's very interesting, again, a non-mainstream scholarship coming, which questions why we need such big projects. And in no way these scholarships are arguing that we don't need to have development and we don't need to have growth. But whether this is the only growth and developmental trajectory, that is something that we need to definitely ask. And this positionality of scientific scholarship as objective, as rational, as something that is going to be consistent over, let's say, 100 years, that also needs to be questioned. So historical understanding is very crucial here, because history on one hand tells us that, oh, this knowledge is universal and this is the rivers, but the rivers are changing courses. And how do we think about this changing course, changing river, along with human need for development? So in no way I'm arguing about, there are cool terms in European scholarship, degrowth and all that, which I don't particularly personally subscribe to. And I think that that's actually something to think about for our audience here. But I do think that that kind of frontier of scholarship, which is thinking about growth and development as human need, for people like us, for people coming from Global South, but at the same time thinking about what are the ways in which we can develop collectively is very important, along with this questioning of scientific rationality and scientific objectivity. And one model that I found very persuasive in my recent research has been emerging mostly from Latin America and unfortunately not from India. Sri Lanka, again, is probably a good place to explore this kind of scholarship, but I'm not sure so much about India. I'll
Yeah, I think we have another question from Debarti Datta, and this is for Dr. Deepti. How has the recent floods in the hills and doors just a month back fetishized NGOs?
Hi, thank you, Devarati, for that question. I'm turning the video off because my network is unstable. I hope I'm audible.
You're
Yes, please go
audible.
ahead.
Yeah, yeah. Even I am putting my camera off because this is like slight disturbance in the net. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so, would you like to elaborate on that question a little bit more?
Yeah, actually, like just for the audience and everybody, like not belonging to the hills or the doers, they might not be aware, or others who are listening, that like a month back there has been this again a huge kind of a flood, and a lot of areas of doers have been submerged. So, and like the place from where we are all working, it's like very closely situated in doers. So when I got so much of reports and coverages, and even the NGOs who are working in these areas, you will constantly see a lot of them going to these relief camps, and there is so much of talk of the how the NGO, like the here the common people are saying it's not the government has barely reached to them at their need, because these places are far off from the main metropolis, like which is Siliguri. So even before any relief could come, and there has been a lot of debates regarding that, even the like small boats which could come, they were really the NGOs who flooded into the areas from various places. So this you'll see a lot of NGOization, or given the kind of a situation that we are in, like in this part, like of the place in Duars. I don't know about the hills, but I'm talking about Duars. However, what happens is, just 15 days after everything has happened, there's too much of relief material who has come from various places. People are donating this and that. But then there is complete silence in the media, and everything has gone off. Now the state comes up, and the state like claims that that NGOs have only tried to capture like the media attention for some time, and tried to critique the state and this and that. But when it comes to building the the building the structures, or doing the more developmental work, it's like I've again going back to the uh, discourse of developmentalism, it's only the state which has come. So this kind of NGOization of the disaster when it happens has not helped the people in any ways. So do you think, like what is the scenario, first of all, in the hills, and second of all, like do the NGOs or even the state personals who are related to the relief work department, do they at all go for any focus group discussion with the people who have been affected by the disasters, and or is it only just the whatever the state machinery ends up saying, or the media ends up saying, and we find at the bottom level the people who are suffering still without anything substantial to fall back upon?
Thank you, Devarati, for that question. I think it's a very important point you have raised. And what we did see after the flood thing that happened in 23, and what also happened recently in Mirik, which was right in the middle of festivities and everything. I think what did happen was, for the first time amongst all the news that caught my attention, was that
there was an immediate declaration and announcement of sort of like remorse and regret coming from the Prime Minister's office, the President's office, and very big level news. And then we had the CM visiting immediately after, and there was a lot of glamour around it, and it just died out after 2 days. And the first thought that ran my head was, okay, at least it took a disaster for these regions to be figured in the Prime Minister's speech or whatever. And what followed up was a lot of people, it was in the middle of the festivities, and a lot of people were aware of what has happened given the news outlets and the social media channels and everything. But I still feel that even 2023, for the Mirik and all these places happened recently in October, but even a disaster as big as 2023 the Gulf thing that happened in Tista is something that remains. Like I started with the example of the Tista troopers and the young boys was because like I felt I was in the heart of like being aware and knowing of what was happening. A lot of conversations around questions of relief. Is it actually being reached down to the people? Are they really the recipients of it? Then the politics that gets intermingled in between, which are the stakeholders. There's an announcement of a huge lump sum fund that is being released by the state, but then it never reaches the real people at the grassroots level. And then there are certain like photos and media pop-ups and everything happening which shows that relief materials are being sent and all of it. But when you talk to these young boys who are from there and who have been in the past 2 years working to sort of set up rehabilitation camps where they are using platforms like music to promote their stories, was a very stark presentation of the realities in the grassroots. And what I found out from these conversations was that there's a huge increase in drug abuse, substance abuse in these places amongst these young boys. After 2023, one of the major consequences has been an increased rise, a sharp rise in suicidal tendencies and suicidal deaths by suicide amongst these young people, which and also despair in terms of how even till date that a lot of these people continue to live in very deplorable conditions. And on the other side of fetishization of NGOs or NGOization, what I would say is that for me, what I saw as a significant development, which Ritiman pointed out in his question also, and I couldn't address, but I'll sort of club it here, was that I felt that for the first time in the hills, at least, given the politics of the place and how it has been predominated by one particular question of the statehood movement, questions of development has always been difficult to address because it's always been presented and there's politics involved to it in terms of is it statehood versus development, which technically is not like either or, but that itself has been a problematic space to start with. And given the levels at which political stakeholders are involved, there has been an absolute crisis in terms of having civil society space. So immediately after the 2023 disaster, what happened was that, like I said, a mechanism that was put into place, which we have seen in the past agitation period when there have been bunds and strikes for long, long days, months, and COVID lockdown. Even then, what we have seen is that people informally organize themselves into these groups, and then they sort of look out for each other, support systems where the Samaj plays a very important role. And somehow there's a system that is kept running where, there's a support system for each other. The same system was put into place in the 23 disaster aftermath also, and out of which was born a civil society. I think it's like an NGO, which was made up of young people from the region who were going on a very everyday basis, who were monitoring the situation, documenting the situation, narrating these stories, putting it out there and working for relief and organizing these aspects, and it's called Save the Hills, and they have ever since been documenting, and I think it's one of the most reliable source of information also, given the way that they've documented even after the Mirik thing that happened. They were there on day 2 or 3 of what happened and silently just documenting and keeping these information vitally preserved, and it was very powerful conversations from very far flung places where lots of locals, for instance, are dependent on tourism. This region runs on tourism, and the economy, like I think Professor Gudavati also pointed out, that it's a catch-22 situation where the it's development cannot be rejected, but I think the larger question is what kinds of development, because if there's no tourism, then there's no economy. And a lot of young people are reliant upon homestays and tourism and these kind of practices. But the question now is how can it be made sustainable, and how do you actually bring these stakeholders to the table? Because from my observation, what has happened is that although there are political elites who are speaking for the people or so-called representing the people, they have not successfully managed to actually give space or voice to the people who are, like you rightly pointed out, Debarati, that the actual recipients or the common people who are suffering from it, their voices still continue to be left out of these discussions. And I think any kind of framework or deliberation or policies that's designed would be incomplete without taking into account these voices, where they are actually affected and how it affects them. So I think that's my take on this. I hope it made sense.
Thank you. Thank you a lot for hearing that. And also, that brings into, I think, what Dr. Anubha was discussing, as you rightly say, that, even the affected, the recipients, they often how the state makes them, because in my place or through my experiences with speaking with the victims from very close quarters, we see that how the party and government personnel, they bring together these affected peoples who have often criticized the government for not offering much, but because of the empty space sometimes, as you have rightly pointed out, why is that empty space of the civil society so stark at times over here? And but at the same time, lot of when disaster happens, lot of them come over, but then in the usual everyday reality, there is hardly much space for them, or for hardly much voices from them. Their connect with the common people is much less, and due to all of it, the state again comes and appropriates these spaces, and through by making a deal with the commoners. So that kind of politics is often always emerging, especially in the margins from where I see. And that all, but at the one line, I would ask perhaps another thing which intrigued me, that you spoke about the Save the Tista movement and all that. So do you think that these groups have now built up more networks with other groups who are similarly invested in the environment preservation concept, from, let's say, from the Uttarakhand or from the Himalayan other belts of the Himachal or these things? Is there kind of a connection or often dialogues or between these groups also happening at some level?
Yeah, but maybe we need to also, bring it to a closure. So a quick response, and then perhaps we can close the debate. Yeah.
Yes, surely. Sorry.
Yes. Who is responding to the question?
Yeah, it was, I think, aimed for
Okay.
Deepti ma'am. Yeah.
I can say something which is probably related, but not directly. And Deepti, if you want to jump in anytime, I'll keep my response very brief. I do think, Bharat Sevak Samaj, by the way, the organization that I did not have time to discuss, was an NGO. So it was a government-sponsored NGO. NGO comes in many varieties. It's non-governmental organization, so there is definitely a stake of government in sort of composing that these organizations. I do think that there is no easy response to this between the local and the regional or the global. It's a question both of scale, but also it's a question of the content of the project, the content of the development project. Some projects are clearly much more scalable, or they can be downsized very quickly, or they can be upscaled very quickly. I guess Professor Vijay would be in a better position to talk about this. But NGOs, as far as NGOs are concerned, there's a variety of NGOs today operating, and definitely the connection between media, NGO, and the state is also something that needs to be explored. I do think that this sense that there is a coherent civil society is also, like Professor Vijay's earlier question, is also overtly glorified. What is a civil society? When we ask ourselves that question, usually we come to people who are very socially who have a social and cultural capital, who can typically use social media in our generation in a very effective way, in a very politically effective and charged way. And also people who have certain command over certain languages. I think I'm going back to what Kiki's presentation was about in certain ways, that English-speaking people are seen to be more effective communicators of social concerns, of social anxieties, and I think that's a very problematic, across board, universally almost, a very problematic way of constructing social demands, and also constructing social dissent, because a lot of what gets talked about through gossip, through rumor, through vernacular languages of protest and dissent, and also community building is very critical to negotiate with, to identify and negotiate.